raising serious questions about U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. President Donald Trump has just issued a stark ultimatum to Cuba, warning the island nation to make a deal before it is too late or face catastrophic economic consequences. This isn't diplomatic posturing. This is economic warfare with real-world implications for millions of people. Trump's latest statement comes on the heels of the unprecedented U.S. military raid that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and now he's threatening to completely cut off Cuba's oil lifeline. What does this deal even look like? How did we get here? And what happens to 11 million Cubans caught in the crossfire? Today, we're breaking down Trump's ultimatum, the collapsing Cuban economy that's already on life support, and the geopolitical chess game playing out 90 miles from Florida's shores. On Sunday, January 11th, 2026, President Trump took to Truth Social with a message that was impossible to ignore. There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. He wrote in all caps. I strongly suggest they make a deal before it is too late. No diplomatic channels, no State Department press release, just a direct threat delivered via social media that could determine the fate of an entire nation. Here's what just happened. Following the January 3rd raid on Caracas that resulted in Maduro's capture, Trump has now set his sights on Cuba, Venezuela's closest ally in the region. For decades, Cuba has relied on Venezuelan oil to keep its lights on and its economy functioning. We're talking about approximately 35,000 barrels per day, which represents roughly 50% of Cuba's total oil deficit. That's not a luxury, that's survival. And it gets worse. The Trump administration has already seized 5 oil tankers carrying sanctioned Venezuelan crude, effectively choking off the supply line that Cuba depends on. No oil shipments have departed from Venezuelan ports to Cuba since Maduro's capture earlier this month, according to shipping data analyzed by Reuters. But Trump didn't stop there. He claimed that Cuba had been receiving large amounts of oil and money from Venezuela in exchange for providing security services to Venezuelan dictators. During the raid on Caracas, 32 Cuban nationals, members of Cuba's armed forces and intelligence services, were killed in what Cuban officials described as combat actions. Trump acknowledged these deaths in his post, saying most of those Cubans are dead from last week's USA attack. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel fired back immediately. No one dictates what we do. Cuba does not attack. It has been attacked by the U.S. for 66 years, and it does not threaten. It prepares, ready to defend the homeland to the last drop of blood. The critical question everyone's asking, what deal is Trump actually proposing? Because he provided zero details about what such an agreement would entail. To understand why this ultimatum matters so much, we need to look at the numbers, and they paint a devastating picture. Cuba's economy isn't just struggling. It's in what experts are now calling free fall. According to the New York Times, Cuba's economy has never been worse, with widespread power outages, medicine shortages, and rising food prices creating a humanitarian crisis. Let's break down the oil dependency. When Hugo Chavez was Venezuela's president, he kept Cuba afloat with approximately 90,000 barrels of oil daily. That was the golden era for Cuban-Venezuelan relations. By the last quarter of 2025, that number had already plummeted to just 35,000 barrels per day as Venezuela's own oil production collapsed under economic mismanagement and international sanctions. Now, Trump is threatening to reduce that to zero. Here's the mechanism at work. Cuba produces very little of its own oil and has minimal refining capacity. The island needs to import approximately 70,000 barrels per day to meet basic energy needs. Venezuela had been covering 50% of that deficit. The remaining oil comes primarily from Mexico, which emerged as an alternative supplier in recent weeks, though Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum clarified they haven't increased volumes. They've just become an important supplier by default as Venezuela's supply dried up. But here's the kicker. Without Venezuelan oil, Cuba cannot power its electrical grid, and we're already seeing the catastrophic results. Cuba's power grid has completely collapsed multiple times in the last 6 months. Even Havana, the capital city that typically receives preferential treatment, is experiencing 4-hour daily blackouts. Outside the capital, residents are living without electricity for much of the day. In some provinces, people have power for only a few hours every 24-hour period. The electrical crisis creates a domino effect across every sector of Cuban life. Hospitals can't reliably refrigerate medicines. Food spoils without refrigeration. Water pumps don't work during blackouts. Businesses can't operate. Tourism, one of Cuba's few remaining economic lifelines, is evaporating as visitors cancel trips to avoid the blackouts. According to energy analysts, Cuba currently faces an electricity deficit of 1,760 megawatts, guaranteeing prolonged and widespread blackouts across the entire nation. Let's compare this to a historical precedent, the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. When Soviet subsidies ended, Cuba entered what it called the special period, characterized by severe economic depression, food rationing, and energy shortages. But even that crisis didn't happen this suddenly or this completely. The Soviet withdrawal was gradual. Trump's oil cutoff is immediate and total. The cause and effect relationship is straightforward and brutal. No Venezuelan oil means no fuel for Cuba's aging thermal power plants. No electricity means no water pumping, no food production, no economic activity. No economy means no government revenue. No revenue means no ability to purchase oil on the open market, even if suppliers were willing to sell. It's a death spiral. To make this accessible, think of it like removing the foundation from underneath a house. The Venezuelan oil wasn't a luxury Cuba enjoyed. It was the concrete foundation holding up the entire structure. Remove it suddenly, and everything collapses at once. You can't gradually adjust to having no foundation. You just fall. Trump is also invoking what he's rebranded the Monroe Doctrine, a play on the 1823 Monroe Doctrine that asserted U.S. supremacy in the Western Hemisphere. His administration has made clear this isn't just about Cuba, it's about establishing complete U.S. dominance over Latin America. After the Venezuela raid, Trump suggested military operations targeting Colombia sounds good, and has repeatedly told Colombian President Gustavo Petro to watch his ass. He's imposed sanctions on Petro, Colombia's first left-wing leader, claiming he's allowing drug cartels to flourish. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban exiles and a longtime advocate for regime change in Cuba, is driving much of this policy. Trump even reposted a message suggesting Rubio could become president of Cuba, adding his own comment, "Sounds good to me." This isn't subtle diplomacy. This is openly discussing regime change. The final data point that matters: Trump reinstated Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism just days after taking office for his second term. President Biden had lifted that designation in his final days in office. By reimposing it, Trump has made it nearly impossible for Cuba to engage in international banking, access credit markets, or conduct normal trade, even with countries willing to defy U.S. pressure. So who actually suffers when Trump turns off Cuba's oil spigot? Let's break this down by category, because the impact varies dramatically depending on where you sit in this crisis. For ordinary Cuban families, this isn't politics, it's survival. Maria Elena Sabina, a 58-year-old parking attendant in Havana who was born shortly after Castro took power, told Reuters, "There's no electricity here, no gas, not even liquefied gas. There's nothing here." These aren't abstract economic indicators. These are people who can't cook food, can't refrigerate medicine, can't run businesses, and increasingly can't see a future in their own country. Over the past 5 years, Cuba has experienced a record-breaking exodus, primarily to the United States, as hundreds of thousands have fled the deteriorating conditions. Alberto Jimenez, a 45-year-old Havana produce vendor, showed defiance when asked about Trump's threat. "That doesn't scare me, not at all. The Cuban people are prepared for anything. But preparation doesn't generate electricity or put food on tables." Another resident, Paula Perez, was more pragmatic. Cuba is not to blame for U.S.-Venezuelan relations, but will be affected quite a lot. Trump knows perfectly well that he has to find a solution, because he can't just take over Cuba like that. Small businesses and entrepreneurs, part of Cuba's small but growing private sector, face immediate collapse. Without reliable electricity, restaurants can't serve food, shops can't open, and the informal economy that many Cubans depend on simply stops functioning. Tourism operators are watching their bookings evaporate as international travelers avoid a destination with daily blackouts and increasing instability. For larger economic players, the situation presents both opportunities and risks. U.S. companies in the oil and shipping sectors could potentially benefit if Trump opens new channels for Cuban trade in exchange for political concessions. But international companies doing business with Cuba face impossible choices. Mexico has emerged as a critical alternative oil supplier, but Mexican President Sheinbaum is walking a tightrope, trying to help Cuba without triggering U.S. sanctions or threats. International partners are responding with caution and concern. The European Union has consistently opposed the U.S. embargo on Cuba, but hasn't taken concrete action to counteract Trump's latest pressure campaign. Russia and China, Cuba's other major supporters, have their own economic problems and haven't stepped in to replace Venezuelan oil. Canada, traditionally more friendly to Cuba than the United States, is watching nervously as the humanitarian situation deteriorates. Expert warnings are stark and getting starker. According to analysis reported by NPR, the loss of Venezuelan oil could totally paralyze Cuba's economy in the short term. Economists studying the situation note that Cuba lacks the foreign currency reserves to purchase oil on the open market at current prices, even if willing sellers could be found who aren't deterred by U.S. threats. U.S. intelligence assessments, according to Reuters reporting on confidential CIA analyses, paint a grim picture of Cuba's economic and political situation. However, these assessments offer no clear support for Trump's prediction that Cuba is ready to fall. The CIA's view is that key sectors like agriculture and tourism are severely strained, and losing Venezuelan oil will make governing more difficult for Diaz-Canel, but a complete regime collapse isn't considered imminent. The ripple effects extend across multiple sectors. Agriculture can't function without fuel for tractors and irrigation. Healthcare facilities are already reporting medicine spoilage due to unreliable refrigeration. The education system faces disruptions as schools lose power midday. Water treatment and distribution systems are failing, raising serious public health concerns. This isn't just economic pressure. This is the systematic dismantling of basic social infrastructure. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez issued a sharp rebuke to Trump's demands, asserting that Cuba has the absolute right to import fuel from any willing exporter without interference or subordination to the unilateral coercive measures of the United States. He added that, unlike the U.S., Cuba does not engage in blackmail or military coercion against other states. Rodriguez also denied Trump's claim that Cuba received financial compensation for security services, though he didn't deny providing such services to Venezuela. President Diaz-Canel went further in his response, stating, "Those who turn everything into a business, even human lives, have no moral authority to point fingers at Cuba for anything, absolutely anything." On Monday, January 13th, he clarified that Cuba has had no talks with the U.S. government except for technical contacts related to migration issues. He insisted Cuba remains willing to engage in serious and responsible dialogue based on sovereign equality, mutual respect, and principles of international law, but only without interference in internal affairs and with full respect for our independence. The legal and diplomatic implications are significant. By unilaterally cutting off a nation's energy supply and demanding political concessions, Trump is employing what international law experts would classify as coercive diplomacy or economic warfare. The United Nations has consistently voted to condemn the U.S. embargo on Cuba, most recently by a vote of 187 to 2, with only the U.S. and Israel opposing the resolution. Political reactions have been mixed. Republicans largely support Trump's hardline approach, viewing it as long overdue pressure on a communist regime. Democrats and human rights organizations have expressed concern about the humanitarian impact on ordinary Cubans who had no role in government decisions. International condemnation has been muted, with most countries unwilling to directly challenge Trump's aggressive hemispheric policy. In the short term, over the next 30 to 90 days, expect Cuba's electricity crisis to worsen significantly. If Mexican oil supplies don't increase dramatically, and if no other suppliers emerge, Cuba will face the worst blackouts in its modern history. Food shortages will intensify. Medicine stockpiles will deplete. The exodus of Cubans attempting to reach the United States will likely accelerate, creating a border crisis that ironically undermines Trump's own immigration policies. The medium-term scenario over the next 6 to 12 months presents two possible paths. Either Cuba capitulates and agrees to some form of deal with Washington, potentially including political reforms, releasing political prisoners, or severing ties with remaining U.S. adversaries. Or Cuba doubles down on defiance, potentially seeking closer ties with Russia and China, accepting even more severe economic hardship as the price of independence. A third, darker possibility is social unrest and political instability as the Cuban population reaches a breaking point. What remains unclear is what Trump actually wants from Cuba beyond submission and regime change. No specific demands have been articulated, no negotiating framework has been established. It's an ultimatum without terms, which makes compliance nearly impossible, even if Cuban leaders wanted to cooperate. So let's recap the three most critical points. First, Trump has threatened to completely cut off Cuba's oil supply from Venezuela, which represents 50% of the island's energy needs, creating an immediate humanitarian and economic crisis. Second, Cuba has defiantly rejected Trump's ultimatum, insisting that no one dictates their internal affairs, setting up a potential showdown with unpredictable consequences. Third, the lack of any specific deal terms means this is essentially a demand for submission without a clear path forward, trapping 11 million people in economic warfare they didn't choose. The key takeaway, Trump's Cuba ultimatum isn't just about one island nation. It's a test case for his Don Roe Doctrine vision of complete U.S. dominance in Latin America, with real human costs that will be measured in darkness, hunger, and desperation. Here's my question for you. Does economic pressure on governments ever work when ordinary citizens bear all the suffering? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon. Sometimes the most dangerous ultimatums are the ones without answers. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.